I have a very clear-eyed view of the strategic competition, and I don't think that there's likely to be any major change in that for some time to come. But, I think there are some particular choices that can be made in the next administration that could at least cabin that competition from spilling out into outright conflict.
What is your sense about the general interest level in China regarding the U.S. Presidential election?
I just came back from a month in China, in Beijing and Shanghai, and perhaps unsurprisingly, I found that the level of interest in the US election is incredibly high. Certainly, all of my interlocutors, whether they were academics or government officials, even ordinary people, are extremely interested in the US presidential election and following it very closely. I think that's probably would have been true under, almost any circumstance. But I think there's such a widespread understanding that U.S.-China relations are particularly poor right now. That I think is part of what is driving this intense interest in the U.S. presidential election. So just about every conversation I had over the month in China, no matter what the other topics of the conversation were, there would be some portion that was devoted to lots of questions to me about the very specific dimensions of the presidential race. And of course, it was a very dramatic month in terms of news about the race. So that just drove the questions even more.
Do you have a sense that Chinese elite or even leaders have a preference between the two candidates?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Professor Wang Jise just published a long piece in Foreign Affairs along with some colleagues speaking to this exact question. And I think in broad terms, it's clear that there are lots of different opinions. I think that the Chinese leadership is very cautious not to express a particular preference because lots of reasons, but including not wanting to be accused of, election interference. But it's very clear that there are different arguments circulating among the elites. I think a baseline perspective, which is reflected in Professor Wang Jise's Foreign Affairs piece, is an understanding that this difficult moment in U.S.-China relations is likely to persist for the foreseeable future, that what we sometimes term the bipartisan consensus on China is likely to limit the range of policy options for the relationship for either a Republican or a Democratic administration. But then I think there's some understanding that there are some issues that can be understood to potentially be a little bit different based on the administration. I think there's an understanding that perhaps trade issues are of particular importance to Donald Trump. And so if he were to be elected president again, one could imagine a return to some of the dynamics that launched the initial U.S.-China trade war back when he was initially president. If Kamala Harris is elected president, one would imagine that a lot of the current Biden approach will continue, and that includes, particularly working with allies, includes some effort to find spaces for cooperation on issues like climate change or public health, and maybe some steps towards continuing to strengthen the dynamics of people-to-people exchange. We've just heard that Tim Walz, governor of Minnesota, is going to be on the ticket. And it's clear that Governor Walz has some history that is quite unique on the questions of student and people-to-people exchange generally. So one could imagine that there would be a little bit more room for that in a Harris administration. But these, I think, in many ways are on the margins. I think the main thrust of U.S. policy towards China will be more or less in the same zone under either Trump or a Harris presidency. And I think even though these are questions that are probably hotly debated within Chinese elite circles, I think on the whole, there's an understanding of that.
To what extent do you think China will be a live issue in the upcoming election?
Yeah, one of the things that I was a little bit surprised by was in that first presidential debate between then candidate Joe Biden and Donald Trump, China didn't really come up that much. I think it only was mentioned in passing a couple of times. I was a little surprised by that, to be honest, because of how much China has been a political issue in recent years. But on reflection, I think that that is some indication that, more or less the two parties have a similar broad approach to China. And there are so many ways in which the Biden administration has continued the policies of the Trump administration in terms of tariffs, in terms of concern over, issues like Xinjiang and Hong Kong and Taiwan. There's not a lot of room there for there to be real political argument. And so I think that was interesting. I think it was interesting that that did not come up in that presidential debate. And of course, there's still many months before the election, and that could change, but as of right now, my guess is that other issues, more domestic issues, will be more front and center in this election than the China issue in particular.
What do you perceive as the differences between these two candidates and China? And would you maybe expect a different policy approach to China based on which candidate wins?
Yeah, I think, I sort of telegraphed my own views a little bit in my earlier response, talking about the views of Chinese elites who are following this, and I think more or less I also have the view that the broad contours of U.S. policy towards China are not going to be that different. I think the main variables that could lead to some difference would be perhaps the emphasis of a new Trump administration on trade issues, or conversely, the interest that a Harris administration might have on human rights issues. Also, the interest that a Harris administration, perhaps informed by the experience and perspective of Vice President, if he's elected, Tim Walz, would have on people-to-people exchange and student exchange. Yes, also the question of allies would seem to be one that a Harris administration following up on the Biden administration would put more energy and investment into. And these perhaps are significant. It does seem to me, though, that they are more on the margins of the wider U.S. China competition framework, which built up over the last couple of administrations, at least, and I think is likely to persist for the foreseeable future. Yeah, I think, in some ways, maybe my perspective for those who are hoping for some improvement in U.S.-China relations sounds like a pessimistic one. I do think it's a realistic one. I have a very clear-eyed view of the strategic competition, and I don't think that there's likely to be any major change in that for some time to come. But, I think there are some particular choices that can be made in the next administration that could at least cabin that competition from spilling out into outright conflict. And then there's some choices that could be made that could preserve some space for some cooperative dynamics, again, maybe in the realm of people-to-people exchange broadly, but also maybe specifically on shared global challenges like climate and public health. I would be interested, regardless of which administration takes power in January 2025, I would be interested to see if they are open to exploring some of those possibilities for cooperative dynamics, even though the wider landscape is clearly going to be one of strategic competition for the foreseeable future.